Hello everyone, so let's start with the Lowenthal Sicilian first, I mean the main line, and then we will go to the early sidelines for white. So here we go with e5, and let's start with knight b5 move. This is the strongest continuation for white. Here we go a6, so white has to go knight d6 check. The move knight c3 will be also covered, it's not scary. Okay, knight d6 check, we of course take. Queen takes d6, and now we go queen e7. This is what I recommend in this course. And first let's start a bit discussing this queen f6 move, because this is the old main line. So if we go from the practical point of view, we assume that our opponent could be prepared for the queen f6 move, because it's like the old main line, and the queen e7 move, its popularity started just several years ago. So queen f6, here he has different options. The main move of course is queen d1, and after queen e7 it also queen d1, but also he has some moves like, let's say, queen c7 here, quite a nasty and unpleasant move. So if he plays after queen e7, queen c7, here it's not a move at all, because you go just d5, and he has nothing better than just to take, because otherwise he would miss the pawn on e4. So you take, and this is just a wonderful position for you, because after queen e7, if he takes here on e7, you take back, and since there he played queen c7 and then took, you have an extra move with d5. So this is the point. Queen c7 is good move after queen f6, but after queen e7 is not good at all. After queen f6, there is also interesting move queen d2. The idea is that after, let's say, queen d1, you go queen g6, and now this pawn on e4 is hanging. So after knight c3, let's say you go knight g7, this is a good move, and now it's difficult for him to continue the development. The g2 pawn is hanging, so the bishop can't go, so he can't castle short side, and this is kind of a problem for white now. So queen d2 move I was talking about has this idea that sometimes at some point he can go for f3, and now the queen protects the pawn on g2, and so the bishop can go to c4 or d3, then castle short side. So this is the idea of queen d2, but as you can assume, after queen e7 nobody wanted to target that g2 pawn anyway, so queen d2 just blocks the way for this bishop. Yet it has the idea to go with b3 and then develop the bishop, maybe castle alongside, so the queen doesn't block the way for the king and the rook, but it's not that scary here, and we will see it in the next videos. In this video I would like to start from the queen takes e7 move, because let's imagine that your opponent doesn't know this line, so he is surprised and he wants to play safe. So he would probably try to exchange the queens and then try to use his pair of bishops. So as you can guess, white has a pair of bishops, so he can hope for some small advantage in this endgame. But also white is not developed at all, while black already has developed two of his knights and can castle short side at any moment. But let's say it immediately. We rarely go for the short castle in this position. We usually try to break in the center with d5 immediately, develop our bishop to e6 or to f5 if it's possible, and then castle alongside. So this is more or less our plan, because from here our king will support our queen side forces, because white will get 3 pawns on the queen side against our 2 pawns. Let's say after knight c3, d5. If the pawns get exchanged here, then your king will support your queen side. And on the king side, you sometimes want to start some pawn storm, so it's not necessary to have a king there. You want to be more close to the center or to the queen side usually. So d5 is the move here, as you can see, and What is it about this d5 move? The point is that if he takes on d5, you have this knight b4 move. You attack the pawn on c2, and also you attack the pawn on d5, so he can't save both at the same time, so you will get your pawn back. This is the idea. And e takes d5, it's not that bad move, but some people also like taking with a knight. I mean, not like they enjoy doing it, they just could take it, so we should be prepared for it. We just take back and again go with knight b4. So now the pawn on c2 is hanging. If he goes like king d1 or king d2, you have this bishop f5 move, developing a piece with a tempo. c2 is hanging, then you have time to take on d5 or castle alongside and take there with the rook, so this king is under attack. This is not good for white at all. So instead of king d1, bishop d3 looks like a better choice, but then you can just take, and yes, you get this position with opposite colored bishops, but you still have some advantage here. You want to take on d5 with your rook, and then you will put pressure on the d3 pawn, so this is gonna be a bit passive for white, and you still have some chances. If you're a better player, you can outplay your opponent. If your opponent is stronger, then okay, maybe it's also good if it ends with a draw anyway. So what else can you want from the position, from the opening with black? I mean, after against a strong opponent, f4 is a move here. Probably I should mention it, because if you take here and he takes back, then he has this rook c1 move, and then he can penetrate. Also his d5 pawn is a passed pawn, which can be a very good strength at some point. So it's not something you want to allow. Better to go with the rook d8 here, attacking that pawn. So now if you take, you just take back, and both of his pawns are hanging, so you will get it back. And there was actually one game with this position after rook d8 d6 was played, but they still transposed to that position anyway. So d4 he took, castle, bishop e6, and finally black managed to outplay white here. He took on e5, then he castled short, and suddenly it's white's king who was under attack, and white couldn't manage to save the game here after g4 eventually resigned, because something like this hangs a piece. So this is about the knight takes d5 move. You just take knight b4, and then you are very okay in this endgame. Try to push for a win. Instead, e takes d5 deserves more attention, but you still go with knight b4. And here, after bishop d3, you have a very strong move, but I again want to go back to this position. After queen f6, white wants to can take on f6, and then we can get more or less the same position like this. And here sometimes white really goes for this line, because after exchange bishop f5, they don't try to passively defend on d3, like playing just castle short here, then like rook e1, some initiative for white. The pawn on d5 can be strong at some point. So some people go for this, and they might try to do the same against queen e7 as well. So it's like they take, knight c3 d5 ed, knight b4, and bishop d3, hoping for the same line. But here, since your knight is on e7, you have a better move. This move is bishop f5. And now white is in some kind of trouble. The best move here is to go knight e4, but it's rarely seen in practice. People rarely find this move. They usually do something else. For example, if he takes on f5, you can take back and then just take on c2. This is quite good. And this kind of position is really nice for black, because the d5 pawn is going to be weak, because it can't really move. The knight on f5 will eventually land on d6 or e7, even attacking that pawn with the rook on d8. The other knight can jump to d4, blocking the d5, so this pawn can be surrounded by your pieces. And also this knight, which defends it, can be kicked by b5, b4 at some point, so those are some ideas I would like you to know. And this is a good position for black, and there was one game where black eventually managed to win, but yeah, I don't think they both played perfectly here, but just to quickly show you that you still should try to look for some activity. And here you see that this move knight c4 was kind of a good example. If you take the knight take e3, knight takes e3 comes bishop c1, and then he restricted the dark squared bishop, which is quite problematic for white here, and we will see such a theme in this video again. And okay, I also need to mention that in this particular video I don't want to show you some lines to memorize. I want to show some theories of beginning of the variation, but then I just want you to understand the ideas, how to handle this endgame, what to aim for and what to try to avoid. So this is how it should work, because this is an endgame and it's just a playable position. So if he castles short, this move is also quite often seen in practice. Then you want to usually take on d3, and after cd, rook d8. This is also a good move to understand, because this idea is like you want to take on d5 after the exchanges with the rook, so it will put pressure on this poor d3 pawn. It's not like you want to take it right away and then white will have time to support the pawn on d5. You want to leave him with a backward pawn, even though sometimes it's vice versa, it just depends on the circumstances. But here, okay, rook d8, and there were two games played this way. In one of them, a3 was played, and here, okay, you could just take on d5 and play rook takes d5. This is a very nice position. You want to have another rook on d8, the knight on f5 or on c6, so you put pressure on the d-pawn, and at some point, if rook d1, you have the idea of pushing e4, so he will have nothing better than playing d4, and then you will have this pawn majority on the king side. Also, you can put pressure on the d-pawn, so white is gonna be really passive, and this is a dream scenario for you. But in the game, knight c2 was played, also quite a possible move. Then he finally took on d5, f6, rook b, c1, knight d4, such a nice square for your knight. And here he played knight e2 check, quite an interesting decision, because it led to a position with rook and pawn against two minor pieces. And as a rule of thumb, here you want to exchange one pair of rooks. So here he tried to do it with rook c8, pinning the knight, but then finally realized that rook d8 was even easier, because then you just give a check and unavoidably. And in this kind of positions, the problem white is experiencing is that there are pawns on both flanks, so a rook can attack both flanks, very quickly switching between them, while white can't really protect both of them. The king is pretty slow piece, so here, as you can see, after rook a1, the pawn was hanging between rook a3, and it's finally lost. So in the game, he eventually won this game, created a second passed pawn on the king side to split white's forces, and finally he won the pawn on a5, and white resigned. Also quite a good endgame strategy for you. So this was a game where after bishop takes d3, c takes d3, rook d8, bishop e3, a3 was played. And again, you can take here, or even knight c2 is good. It's just a playable endgame with good chances for black. But there was also another endgame where bishop e3 was played. So then he took and just grabbing 2 pawns. An extra pawn in the endgame for black from the opening almost immediately. Quite a good thing. So then he managed to convert it, and probably nothing interesting to discuss yet. There was also one game where black didn't take on d3 and played a long castle immediately, and I just want to show you that this is kind of a typical endgame which can sometimes arise from different variations and move orders. So here you like having such positions because your knights are jumping here and there, and it's not easy for white to play because if you start moving the pawns, it just gives more squares for the knights, more outposts. So white should somehow passively defend, but instead he played this move f4. So after taking e4, black got a very nice passed pawn on the central square, and then he played h5 and also f6 to restrict the bishop. So eventually black managed to win the game. And this was about e takes d5 here. So we've covered e takes d5, knight takes d5, and here is the best move in the position, bishop d2. And if your opponent found this move, he probably knows this line, because this was played by Magnus Carlsen against Teimur Rajabov. And Rajabov played bishop e6 here, and here Carlsen castled longside, but most of people take on d5. I suggest that first we start with the game of Carlsen against Rajabov. Black just castle short, and then we are in this stage when you just try to slowly improve the position of your pieces, and then eventually this exchange on d5 comes. So after all of this played, here I just want you to show the scheme that Rajabov used to play in this position to hold it against the world champion, the endgame beast Magnus Carlsen. He played h6, so all of his pawns are on the dark squares, restricting white's dark squared bishop. And after bishop e4, rook d7, he didn't mind exchanging the rooks. But what he found here is this move bishop d5. He wants to exchange the light squared bishops, and if Magnus would take here, then I think that Rajabov would start playing for a win here. This kind of position is something that you should be looking for. You can regroup your knight to e6, then to f4, start rolling pawns on the king side or on the queen side too. So the bishop here isn't that great on c3, but of course objectively white is still not worse, but I just know from practical experience that this is something that you should be aiming for. White has a pair of bishops and you want to exchange one of them. Of course, Magnus didn't exchange the bishop, so he played bishop f5, but Teimur kept waiting. He, I assume, didn't want to go any ahead. He just wanted to keep it balanced because Magnus is a very strong player in the endgames especially, so they were waiting. Here after a4 he didn't want white to go a5 to block the pawns, and then at some point Magnus will start rolling pawns and create a passed pawn, so he played a5, then knight b4, and yeah, the position kept being more or less balanced. At some point Magnus played f4, but Teimur kept waiting, just took on e5 with the knight. Then they also exchanged the rooks, and yeah, probably here we can stop. They eventually made a draw, but there were 40 moves yet. So instead, after bishop e6 here, Magnus castled longside, as you remember, but most of people just take on d5 here. You, of course, take with a knight. They take, you take. This kind of endgame is something that you can quite often see in your games if you play this system. And what you need to remember here is that you need to I mean that here your activity compensates that he has a pair of bishops. But on the other hand, it's not always good for you to be active, like trying to push pawns, because then you would create weaknesses for yourself. So probably the best thing to do is to keep maneuvering with your pieces and make progress with them. And if you manage to exchange one of white's bishops, it's gonna be a good sign that now you can try to move your pawns and try to win the game. So there were different games, for example, bishop e3, king c7, f3, bishop e6, and as you can see, black plays more or less in the Rajabov style with the same ideas, just exchanging the pieces and then made a draw here. And with white we have a grandmaster playing, and with black an international master, but he still managed to make a draw here and hold this possession. And yeah, white realized here that there was no possibilities to win the game because black's pawns are also very strong, so they agreed to a draw. In the other games, bishop c3 was played. Somehow people make this move more often in practice, so you still go with f6, f3, bishop f7. This is quite a good idea because after bishop d3 you have this move bishop g6, so you still want to exchange the bishops. If he takes, now you see that I was talking about this a bit before. This dark squared bishop, it's restricted by your pawns, and also you can try slowly push them like g5, maybe your king will be here, f5, and create a passed pawn or maneuver your knight somewhere to some outposts. This bishop is restricted, and in practice it's difficult for white to manage the pieces here. And bishop c4 was played here, king c7, a3, again this h6 move, like Rajabov did, bishop f5. Then here they found this move repetition and finally agreed to a draw. And also there was another game when white took here on d8, and again here we have the same grandmaster playing with white pieces against a FIDE master, but here black even managed to win the game, and I'll show you the whole game just for learning purposes. Here he played g5, which is quite a risky decision actually, but still, if you are sure that you can outplay your opponent, you can try playing like this as well. So he wanted to open some files, but turned out that after this f4 came, he couldn't open file for himself as well. So probably he shouldn't have closed the g file. So after f4 he could be able to penetrate with the rook to g2 after the exchanges. So be a bit more of prophylaxis here. But anyway, in the game, he tried, as you can see, again exchange the white squared bishops. This is like the main topic here. But then at some point, I think white just missed one thing here with this knight d6 move, and now a fork is coming for 3 pieces at the same time. And after bishop g2 he played bishop e4, and now he wants to take and again that fork. So bishop h4 was played here, but now after the bishops were exchanged, now black of course could push for a win, and eventually they succeed. So just attacking that pawn on g3 and then finally winning a piece, because otherwise the pawn would be promoted if you take here and then take the knight. And then he managed to win the game, but you see that it wasn't so easy at all. So this was more or less about this kind of endgames here. As you remember, white is not that white don't have active possibilities here, just need to try to squeeze and try to use those pair of bishops, and as you can see, Even Magnus Carlsen couldn't manage to win in this endgame, so I hope you also will not lose. And in this position we were talking about the knight c3 move, but there is also one a bit dangerous move, c4, which is quite clever move just to stop you from going d5. Here I tried different options, some knight b4 ideas, like trying to go knight c2, so he needs to go with his knight to the edge of the board, but then I realized that probably the easiest way is to go with knight d4 here, and after bishop d3 you can play like Anna Muzyczuk did here. He played d6. Anna Muzyczuk is a Ukrainian grandmaster. She is a world women rapid and blitz champion at the same time, both. So we can trust her, I think. So she played with f5 here, and then the idea is that your knight will be supported by this other knight coming to c6, so it's difficult to get rid of your knight. And even though your pawn on d6 is a backward pawn, still due to the fact that you closed the d file, white can't really attack it. In the game she still got a bit worse position, but still managed to make a draw here, not without many problems here, but yeah, still you can try to play the same way, and this is more or less a balanced position, so they agreed to a draw. But then I realized that maybe d6 isn't that such a necessary move. You can play with knight c6 immediately here, and now you're already threatening to play knight b4. So look, if your opponent castles short here, then you have this knight b4 move, and you're already winning, because some rook d1, you can just go with knight c2 or take and then knight c2, which is quite nice for you. So this is already quite a trap. If he plays some a3, then knight b3 is here just to fork. So knight c3, I think, is gonna be like the main move that you will meet in practice, because now after knight b4 he has king d2 move, and he looks to be more or less okay. But instead of knight b4 here, I think b5 is a very interesting move. Not so obvious, but very interesting, I think. If he takes, then you have this knight b4 move now, so he has to go king d2, and now you take just ab. And turns out that he can't really take on b5. If he takes with the bishop, it's just a blunder. Knight b3 check, ab, and you take the rook there, so then you can play with bishop a6, exchange that bishop, and just enjoy an extra material. So bishop b5 doesn't work. If he takes knight takes b5, then you take on d3 first. If he takes here, you have a free knight. So knight d6 should be played here. It's kind of the only move for white. But then you go to f8. If you go to e7, then he takes here with check. You don't want to allow it. So you go here. And the idea is that after taking, you have this check from a6. And then you go to e7 again, harassing that knight. Only f5 square is available. And this kind of endgame, I think it's balanced, maybe even a bit better for black, because you can try to push your pawns here. Something like this can happen when you get some initiative on the queen side, while his pawns, it's not easy to move his pawns, and you also have an idea of bishop g2. I mean, your bishop and rook are stopping his pawns, while you have some majority in the center, which is not so easy to block. So here you take, and then after knight d6, king f8 is coming, then check, and king e7. I don't think you will meet this position in practice. People wouldn't take on b5, I think, just being scary of some knight b3 checks. So maybe rook b1 will be played instead, not allowing any knight b3. So now you can take, and I think even the moves like f5 are quite possible here. So you want to open some light squares, his king is under attack, and yeah, I think maybe here we can even stop. This is not the position where you should be afraid of playing. It's already better for black. So this is mostly it about this line. Of course, b3 move also can be played here, but then you go knight b4 anyway, king d2, and just bishop b7, I think, developing your bishop. So here it's kind of a position where you have opposite colored bishops, but look at his king, he's a bit in danger. Knight f4 check coming there at some point, and he can't take here, of course, because of bishop a6, and he's in trouble. So he should play like bishop b4, but then okay, you can't really castle, so just playing like f6, and then your king goes here, your knight comes back to d4. This is not something you should be that much afraid of. Also a bit, maybe a bit better for white, but nothing that serious. I think this is quite playable, more of a equal position. So this was mostly about the endgame line, about the queen takes e7. I think we've covered almost everything that you should know here. Just go d5, blow the center, and enjoy playing these positions. I also want to say, if you're kind of skeptical about having an endgame here, like it's drawish, it's better than having a position where white can force a draw by some forced lines where you are hanging and trying not to lose the game by precise moves, like it always happens in some sharp Sicilians. So here he can't really prepare a line where he can just force a threefold repetition or something like that, or perpetual check. It's playable and you have all of the chances to outplay your opponent, so I hope you will, and see you in the next videos. Bye.